When Pam Bondi accused a sitting federal judge of bending the law for political reasons, most thought it was all talk, until the judge quietly stepped aside and the justice system started to panic. Pam Bondi sat still in her office in Tallahassee, jaw clenched, watching the news on a muted screen. CNN had just broken the story. Judge James Boasberg issued a federal order halting the latest round of deportation flights to El Salvador. The anchor used words like controversial, humanitarian concern, and due process. Bondi didn't flinch. She picked up her pen, tapped it twice against her desk, and said quietly, "They're playing with fire." The case had been brewing for weeks. Venezuelan nationals, some accused of gang activity, others simply undocumented, were being held in ICE detention centers in South Texas. Homeland Security, under pressure to clean up loopholes, had fast-tracked their deportations. It was swift, brutal, and for many, irreversible. A plane was already on the tarmac in McAllen when Boasberg's order came through. The White House was furious. But this wasn't Bondi's first time in the middle of a legal knife fight. She'd built her reputation by going straight at political opponents with a smile on her face and enough legal firepower to blow up a courtroom. She wasn't intimidated by robes or titles. She made 2 calls, first to her deputy, the second to Fox. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse in Washington, D.C., Judge Boasberg was calm. He'd seen the protests, the opinion pieces calling him a traitor. But this wasn't political, he told himself. The administration was skipping hearings, rushing people onto planes without giving them a chance to speak. That violated the law. Full stop. His clerk, a sharp 32-year-old named Lauren C., stepped into his chambers. "They're saying the Attorney General is going to make a statement tonight." Boasberg didn't look up. "Let her. We'll do our job." But outside the court, things were turning ugly. Protesters had begun gathering at both ends of the spectrum. Some held signs that read "Deport the criminals now," others with "Judges are not puppets." Cable hosts were already comparing Boasberg to other activist judges. His face was on the screen more than it had ever been in his life. And Pam Bondi was just getting started. That night on the Ingram angle, Bondi went live. Her voice was calm but biting. She leaned in when Laura Ingram asked if she believed the judge was acting within the law. "He's not acting like a judge," Bondi said. "He's acting like an unelected policymaker." She paused just long enough to let it sting. "And the American people are tired of it." Her words sent a jolt through social media. Hashtags like #FireBoasberg and #PamTheHammer trended within the hour. Senators started calling each other. Journalists flooded inboxes. Inside the DOJ, staffers were quiet. They knew what this meant. Bondi wasn't just speaking her mind, she was drawing a line. 2 days later, the Miami Herald published a leaked memo. It showed that some of the Venezuelan detainees had indeed been flagged as security risks. One had a history of involvement with a gang in Caracas, but others were political asylum seekers. Their files were incomplete. The memo hinted that the flights were rushed to meet a political deadline. That nuance didn't matter to the public anymore. Sides had already been chosen. Bondi's team released a follow-up statement that morning. "Judge Boasberg's actions threaten the independence of our judicial system by allowing partisan influence to override legal protocol." That line was no accident. She was flipping the usual script, claiming that judicial independence wasn't just about judges doing what they wanted, it was about staying in their lane. Inside the Supreme Court chambers, Chief Justice John Roberts took a deep breath when he read the statement. He closed the file in front of him. This wasn't just a clash between 2 branches of government. It was about what Americans believe justice should look like. But Bondi wasn't done. She was building a case, not just against Boasberg, but against the entire system that shielded judges from accountability. 3 days after her Fox News appearance, Pam Bondi stood behind a podium outside the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. The sky was overcast, and the press pool was thicker than usual. Her team had scheduled the press conference at noon, peak broadcast time. Cameras rolled. Reporters held their recorders up like they were catching wind. She didn't waste time. "Let me be clear," Bondi began, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about one judge. It's about an erosion of discipline in our federal judiciary. The American people expect impartiality, not interference." The air went still. Reporters used to the usual soft edge in these briefings felt something different in her tone. This was no press release. It was a warning. She pulled out a stack of documents, case summaries, internal communications, reports from field agents. One stamped with the ICE insignia described 3 Venezuelan nationals whose asylum claims had been bypassed due to insufficient risk classification review. That meant they'd been shipped out without proper protocol. Bondi used it to hit both sides, the judges for stopping everything and the agencies for not tightening their process. And then she dropped the line that made headlines, "I'm not afraid of judges who act like kings. I'm afraid of what happens when no one calls them out." In the hours that followed, Bondi was everywhere. Her words looped on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, each giving it their own spin. On Twitter, her critics painted her as a wannabe autocrat. Her supporters called her fearless. By sunset, a viral TikTok of her speech was circulating with dramatic music and the caption "Pam versus the system." In a bar in Sacramento, a middle-aged man named Curtis Caldwell sat glued to the screen. He wasn't the kind to care about politics, but something about Bondi struck a chord. "She talks like someone who's been fed up for a while," he muttered. His cousin across the booth raised an eyebrow. "Or someone who's gunning for higher office." But Curtis wasn't the only one watching. Inside the federal courthouse in Miami, Judge Lena Dorsey, one of Boasberg's colleagues, listened to the live stream in her chambers. She didn't agree with Boasberg's handling of the case, but Bondi's broadside made her nervous. "She's playing the long game," Dorsey told her clerk. "She's not just pushing back. She's trying to reshape the public's idea of what a judge is." Later that night, Bondi appeared on News Nation for an extended interview. It wasn't a safe network. It was a calculated move, going where the audience was mixed, less tribal. She wore a navy blazer, no jewelry, hair tied back. The look was deliberate, serious, no nonsense. The interview, a young anchor named Trent Massey, didn't hold back. "Attorney General, some say you're undermining judicial independence, that you're making it personal. How do you respond?" Bondi smiled, just barely. "I respect the judiciary, but respect isn't silence. If a judge puts personal beliefs ahead of federal law, they're no longer neutral. They're political." "Is Judge Boasberg political?" "He made a political decision under the cover of legality. That's more dangerous than partisanship. It's betrayal in slow motion." The interview hit a nerve. Massey, after wrapping, texted his producer, "We're going to get heat for this." They did, but so did Bondi. The next morning, protesters lined the DOJ steps. Some held signs showing Bondi's face with duct tape over it, reading "Shut up or step down." Others wore shirts that read "Hold judges accountable." Bondi walked through them on her way to her SUV, unfazed, flanked by security. A reporter shouted, "Are you going to call for Boasberg's removal?" She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. That evening, someone leaked a private DOJ memo suggesting Bondi's office had already drafted a complaint to the Judicial Conference about Boasberg's conduct. If true, it meant she wasn't just grandstanding, she was mobilizing to take him down through formal channels. Chief Justice Roberts read the leak on his tablet in silence. He scrolled, paused, and ran a hand through his hair. His clerk entered the room but didn't speak. Roberts didn't look up. He knew what came next. But Bondi wasn't just taking on Boasberg. She was testing how far public trust in the judiciary could bend before it cracked. Chief Justice John Roberts had always preferred silence to spectacle. He saw himself not as a player in political drama but as the keeper of balance, an anchor against the chaos that often swallowed Washington. But this was different. Pam Bondi had kicked the door in. He knew the memo was real. Bondi's office had submitted the complaint, alleging not only procedural misconduct by Judge Boasberg but a pattern of judicial activism inconsistent with constitutional neutrality. The language was sharp, almost surgical. It was designed to do damage but look clean doing it. That morning, Robert sat alone in his chambers going over the public statement he'd spent the past 2 nights rewriting. He wasn't naive. A weak response would invite more aggression. A strong one might look like he was picking sides. The final draft was barely 4 paragraphs. He released it at 10:42 a.m. For more than 2 centuries the judiciary has served as a pillar of independence in American life. It is not the role of judges to make policy, but neither is it the role of politicians to define judicial restraint by convenience. The judiciary must be free from pressure, free from retaliation, and free from political theatre. He didn't mention Bondi. He didn't need to. The reaction was immediate. Within the hour, The Hill, Politico, and the Washington Examiner were dissecting the language like it was a Supreme Court ruling. Editorialists called it measured, stoic, and insufficient. Bondi supporters pounced on Newsmax. Conservative commentator Reuben Kessler scoffed, "Roberts had a chance to take a stand and he gave us a poetry reading." But Roberts wasn't finished. That evening, he convened a closed-door meeting with senior members of the federal judiciary. No aides, no transcripts, just 15 men and women in a paneled room near Capitol Hill behind layers of security and silence. The conversation was tense. Judge Barrett from Utah spoke first. "She's rallying the public. If this gets traction, they'll come for more than Boasberg." Judge Ruiz from Phoenix agreed. "We need a line, not just statements, action." But Roberts remained calm. "We don't answer pressure with panic," he said. "We remind the country who we are." He ended the meeting with a request: each judge was to return to their district and quietly assess whether judicial protocol had slipped. Not because Bondi demanded it, but because accountability belonged inside the walls, not outside of them. Meanwhile, Bondi wasn't slowing down. She took her message to radio shows, town halls, and online live streams. In Bakersfield, California, she stood in a gymnasium filled with retirees and young families, speaking without notes. This isn't about partisanship. It's about power. And for too long, that power has been shielded by robes and silence. The crowd erupted. Back in D.C., her press secretary received a call from someone inside the White House. "We want her at the next federal law enforcement briefing." And they said, "Make it happen." Just like that, Bondi's crusade was becoming national policy. Inside Boasberg's home, his wife watched the news with quiet tension. She didn't like being in the spotlight. Their kids had started getting weird stares at school. Online commenters had posted their address. One called for a march to his front door. He turned off the TV. "We might have to give her one." Reporters scrambled, cameras clicked on, and the room fell silent as Roberts adjusted the microphone. He walked up quietly after a scheduled panel and asked for the MIC. No teleprompter, just him in a very tired-looking suit. "The independence of the judiciary doesn't mean we operate without scrutiny," he said. "It means we answer to the Constitution, not to polls, not to headlines, and not to fear." He paused. "But we also answer to the people. And if their trust in us fades, it's not because they failed us. It's because we failed them." The room was silent. No applause, no coughing, just a quiet realization that something had shifted. Back in Washington, Bondi watched a clip of the speech from her office alone. She didn't smile. She didn't say a word. But she picked up her phone and sent a text to her advisor. He blinked. The next morning, new protests erupted, not just outside Boasberg's court, but in front of the Supreme Court building itself. 2 groups clashed on the marble steps, one side chanting "Protect the bench," the other yelling "Courts can't be kings." Capitol Police intervened. A few arrests were made. Boasberg, for his part, stayed silent. His office issued a 1-sentence statement: "The judge remains committed to the impartial application of law." It was vague, but it didn't matter anymore. His name had become a symbol of everything broken or everything brave, depending on who you asked. Later that day, Roberts made an unprecedented request. He summoned Bosberg for a private meeting. No aides, no paper trail, just two men sitting across from each other behind a closed door. One defending the bench, the other living through its storm. The conversation never leaked. But the next day, Bosberg announced he would be taking an extended leave of absence to ensure the integrity of ongoing proceedings is not compromised. Bondi called a press conference 2 hours later. "This is not a victory," she said. "It's a warning." But not everyone saw it that way. And for Roberts, the damage was already done. John Roberts didn't sleep the night Bosberg stepped down, not because he regretted the meeting, but because of what it meant. He'd spent his entire career trying to keep the court above the noise, above politics, above pressure. But now the walls were thinner. The public could see straight through, and they were watching. He sat alone in his office at dawn, reading the headlines. Bosberg steps aside after Bondi's campaign. Is the judiciary cracking? Roberts wait, no more but too late. The Supreme Court was supposed to be the last calm in the storm. Now it was part of it. Who called him across the city? Pam Bondi's office was already buzzing. Her team had compiled a list of judges flagged in the last 2 years for alleged procedural overreach. She hadn't said it out loud yet, but she was thinking it. Bosberg wouldn't be the last. Her communications director walked in with a stack of messages. "Support's climbing," he said. "We're getting emails from district attorneys, sheriffs, even a couple of appellate clerks." "Any heat?" "Plenty. Threats, letters from law professors. ABA is drafting a formal condemnation." Bondi didn't flinch. Let them. But behind closed doors, there was tension. Some inside her own circle had begun to worry she was pressing too hard, moving too fast. One advisor asked her that afternoon, "What if they call your bluff?" She stared at him for a second. They already did. And they lost. In Flagstaff, Arizona, a federal magistrate named Harold King watched the coverage over lunch. He'd been on the bench 32 years, never made a headline in his life. Now he wasn't so sure that was a good thing. He pushed his tray away and muttered, "We're not supposed to be famous." "That's the job." His clerk, sitting across from him, kept her voice low. "Do you think they'll come after more of us, King?" Kay didn't answer right away. "I think they've figured out judges don't hit back." Meanwhile, Roberts called a second emergency judicial council, not to talk, but to listen. He wanted to hear from the ground up. Dozens of judges from across the country sent written statements, audio recordings, private memos. Some begged for unity. Others warned that staying quiet had made them look arrogant. But one message stood out. It came from a recently retired district judge in Kansas named Ranger Kellerman. Her note read, "You can't win a PR war with robes in silence. If we want the public to believe in the courts again, they need to see our struggle, not just our rulings." Roberts read it 3 times. Then, for the first time in months, he drafted something long-form, a speech he would deliver in front of the American Bar Association. Untelevised, unfiltered, just judges, lawyers, and words that mattered. He took the stage 2 weeks later in Minneapolis. The room was packed. He didn't bother with small talk. "I've been asked why I didn't respond sooner. The truth is I hoped it would pass. But it hasn't. And maybe it shouldn't." He paused, scanning the room. When judges lose the trust of the people, we lose more than our legitimacy. We lose our purpose. Judicial independence is not a shield from criticism. It's a promise of discipline. And when we break that promise, we deserve scrutiny. There were no cameras, no applause, just quiet nods and the sound of pens scribbling. Back in Washington, Bondi watched a grainy live stream from her tablet. It wasn't a takedown. It wasn't a victory lap. It was something else. She closed the screen and whispered to no one. He finally showed up. Later that day, she met privately with several state attorneys general. She didn't pitch policy. She didn't wave a flag. She asked a question: what happens when the law forgets who it's for? They didn't answer, not right away, but it stayed with them. By late spring, Boasberg's name had faded from the news cycle. He hadn't resigned outright, but it didn't matter. His career had changed forever. His rulings would always carry the shadow of this moment. Roberts, too, had changed. He began attending more public legal forums, not to defend the court, but to explain it, to remind people that justice wasn't just a word but a weight carried by people, fallible and afraid. And Bondi, she was already moving on. A short list of circuit court judges had landed on her desk. But while Bondi prepared her next move, the country was left asking, was this accountability or was it conquest? 6 months after the Boasberg incident, the heat had cooled, but the burn marks were still visible. The courthouse in D.C. had updated its security protocols. Judges traveled with more caution. And in law schools from Seattle to Tallahassee, professors rewrote their syllabi to include a new discussion: what does judicial accountability look like in the age of public pressure? Judge Boasberg never returned to his post. Technically, he was still a federal judge, but he stayed behind the scenes, consulting, writing papers, speaking quietly at universities under Chatham House rules. His name had become a case study, no longer a man. One rainy afternoon, he sat in a small conference room at an American university, talking to a group of second-year law students. They expected bitterness, maybe some subtle jabs at Bondi or the administration, but what they got was a reflection. "I didn't break the law," he said. "But I forgot the people outside the law, the ones watching. That was my mistake." A student raised her hand. "Would you do it differently?" Boasberg gave a small laugh. "I'd do it slower, not softer, just with more care." Pam Bondi, meanwhile, had become a household name again, not for scandal, not for a book deal, but for reshaping the conversation around judges and public trust. She toured the country that fall, speaking at law enforcement summits, legal policy forums, and even a few universities where protesters lined the sidewalks. At one such event in Austin, Texas, a young man asked her directly, "Do you think you damaged the judiciary?" She answered without blinking, "No. I think I reminded them who they serve." He didn't argue. He just sat back thinking. That was Bondi's real talent, not forcing agreement, but forcing the question to stick. In a quiet suburb outside Cincinnati, an elderly woman named Carol Jenkins sat in her kitchen watching an old recording of Bondi's Fox News interview, the one that had started it all. She'd followed every part of the saga, not because she was into politics, but because she'd once lost a case in family court that left her wondering if judges ever heard regular people. She paused the clip and whispered, "Finally someone said it." Her daughter across the table didn't reply. She didn't agree with Bondi, but she couldn't deny one thing: more people were talking about justice than ever before, and that mattered. Chief Justice Roberts stayed in the background after his ABA speech. No new statements, no interviews, but his actions spoke. He approved a sweeping review of internal judicial training on ethics, transparency, and community engagement. It didn't make headlines, but it changed things. Judges started hosting town halls, once a rare practice. They started writing columns explaining how decisions were made, not to justify, but to clarify. In Phoenix, a federal judge opened her courtroom once a month to the public, not for trials, but for questions. Real questions from people who didn't know how the system worked. And she answered without hiding behind legalese. One attendee said afterward, "I didn't agree with her, but I understood her, and that was new." In the end, Bondi didn't push for Boasberg's impeachment. She didn't need to. The point had been made: loud, sharp, permanent. Her critics called her dangerous. Her supporters called her courageous. But she called herself something else: accountable. And maybe that was the lesson. Maybe the story wasn't about heroes or villains, but about discomfort, about asking hard questions out loud, even if the answers weren't clean. Months later, Bondi and Roberts found themselves in the same room. It wasn't planned. a National Judicial Symposium in Baltimore, both invited on separate panels. They passed each other in a hallway during a break. Bondi offered a nod. Roberts hesitated, then returned it. That was it. Not a truce. Not forgiveness. Just two people who had stood on opposite sides of something larger than themselves. The story of Pam Bondi, Judge Bosberg, and John Roberts wasn't about taking someone down. It was about what happens when public trust wavers, and what institutions must do when silence is no longer enough. So here's the question: who watches the watchers when the watchers stop watching themselves? Think about that. Because one day, it might not be a judge under the spotlight. It might be someone who looks a lot like you. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to the channel. We've got more real-world stories that ask the hard questions and refuse the easy answers.